On the 8th floor of a New York City sweatshop, right before closing time, the majority of workers all set to collect their pay and head home to a Saturday afternoon in the city when a fire started. Feeding off pieces of loose linen, within seconds the place was engulfed in flames. Nearly every path to safety for the mostly female teenage workforce failed them. The managers had locked the doors, the cheaply constructed fire escapes buckled and broke, and although the fire department was there in just a few short minutes, their hoses were ineffective and their ladders couldn't reach past the 6th floor. Many burnt alive, and nearly as many jumped to their deaths from the 8th and 9th floors, becoming the worst industrial accident in American history. But was it really an accident? Could it have been prevented with even modest precautions? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. This is the front page of the New York World, the day after the harrowing events just described in what became known as the Triangle Factory Fire. It occurred on May 25, 1911, and though the paper accounts for 154 deaths, there were actually only 146 workers who died that day in the fire. 123 of them were women, young women, the majority between 14 and their early 20s. The far majority were either Jewish or Italian immigrants, working 60 to 70 hours a week for about $7 to $12. And although a dollar was worth considerably more back then, we are still talking about appallingly miserable wages for these women, and in the end, it cost them their very lives. Worse yet, many of them had known just how dangerous and unsafe the factory was, but were powerless to do anything about it. But before we go any further, our exploration question for today's story lecture is, why did the Triangle Factory Fire usher in great progressive reforms, and what is the legacy of this tragedy? So keep that question in mind as we run through the story. But to do that, we need to first jump back into the history to walk around in the world that these women worked day in and day out, and to feel it out for ourselves. So tie up those shoes, we're off to the past. From our last video series, you should know that America had been industrializing since the late 1870s, and there was a massive influx of immigrants, increasing urbanization, and more people working in factories. Few of these workers had rights, and unions were still struggling to be recognized as legal entities. Sweatshops, which are workplaces generally in the textile industry that underpaid and overworked and mistreat their workers. And they were incredibly common in America at this time, and still common in the areas that are producing most of the clothes that chances are you are wearing. So you're saying my clothes is made in a factory, a sweatshop, that mistreats their workers like in this story, that led so many people to die? How is that possible? Yeah, Mahina, chances are your clothes are made in a sweatshop that does mistreat their workers. But it is a complicated story. Those jobs probably pay better than any other opportunity those workers can get. But it happens because they need those jobs, and us, Americans, are willing to pay for it. And that too was the case in America back then. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where the tragedy struck, might actually have been one of the nicer and more modern sweatshops in the city at the time, and it definitely was not an example of as bad as it gets. However, the widespread problems of the Gilded Age led many reformers to struggle against the injustices of the time, and it ushered in a new period of change known as the Progressive Era. This was a period from about 1901 under President Roosevelt to 1919 that tried to reform problems that were caused by two main things, industrialization and urbanization. It was those two things that had caused such drastic change in America and led to horrific problems for so many Americans at the time, and enough was enough. The progressive movement was mostly led by people in the white urban middle class, and women played an especially important role. Jane Addams' Hull House was one of the earliest examples of progressive reform. Jane Addams was a fierce feminist involved in many reform movements for change at the time, and her Hull House provided struggling immigrants new to America with support, education, and it was devoted to uplifting the moral character of the people in what was otherwise a cold and dark city. And her Hull House influenced others, and it led to hundreds of settlement houses throughout American cities. This became a key aspect of the larger progressive movement, to make societal changes that would uplift and improve the moral character and the well-being of those at the bottom of society. I do hope to remind you that the industrial age was one that many people saw as degrading and demeaning the individual, and it led to a rotten and corrupt society of many people just chasing profits and encouraging a social Darwinist mentality of pushing other people down so that one could rise up. And the progressive movement tried to push back against that mentality. To counter social Darwinism, they preached the social gospel, that by following Christ's message of helping and serving the poorest and most vulnerable among us, we can improve the industrial society and support those who are at the bottom of society rather than leave them behind to struggle on their own. But that social gospel was not supported by all Americans, and the owners of the ash building that housed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory neglected to do many things that could have uplifted their workers and ultimately saved 146 lives. Max Blank and Isaac Harris were the owners of the ash building that housed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. They were immigrants themselves who had worked their way up in American society, and they owned multiple factories and businesses as well. They prided themselves on the modern state of their buildings and had even declared the ash building fireproof. However, the workers certainly disagreed. The female workers at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory that Saturday were busy as usual. In common sweatshop form, they were hunkered over their sewing machines in long, cramped rows, doing the same work that they had done day in and day out. Cutting, sewing, tapering, and repeat. On the floor that day, you would see pieces of scrap linen and piled high in scrap bins as well, which will act as a powder keg with even the smallest spark. In fact, that very morning, a female worker had noticed that the buckets that generally stored water in case of a fire were empty. She brought it to the attention of a male supervisor and was berated and ordered back to work. That was common at the time, and with little worker protection laws, speaking about basic safety concerns could get you verbally abused or potentially even fired. But this day killed. Some of those on shift that day had walked out in protest the previous year with local unions who called for a strike. They were demanding better treatment and better pay and safer conditions. However, it failed. They returned to work with the owners refusing all of their demands, but couldn't go any longer without work or pay, so they caved. You see, Blank and Harris, the owners, had skimped on many safety precautions for the building that could have saved their lives. They refused to install sprinkler systems because they were cumbersome and costly. Their fire escapes were rusting away and much too narrow to be effective. And there was never a fire drill because that would slow down work, cost money, and there was no laws mandating it at the time. And that was a key problem that progressives tried to fix across the country, getting the government to do more to ensure safety, protection, and support for the poor people in American cities. Aside from personal charity and private organizations like the Hull House, progressives sought to empower the state or the government to take action to address societal ills. They were calling for a dramatic transformation in the role of government in America. During the Gilded Age, remember, the philosophy of the time was laissez-faire, which meant that the government did not get involved in the economy or society. And progressives wanted to change that, to get the government more involved and to give them more authority.
So wait up, Mr. Luer. The progressives wanted more government? My mom's always saying the government sucks, so why would they want to give them more power?
She sounds like a good American to me, Chloe. But the reason they thought government needed to be stronger was because they believed the government needed to address the problems that society had. Because really nobody else was doing it. Think about it like this. Who picks up your garbage and provides for schooling and water and ensures that that water is clean and safe? But basically, Chloe, Americans had a blind spot. They were so focused on ensuring that the government didn't get so powerful, but at that same time, big businesses and industrialists had so much power and they controlled the average person way more than government ever did. And they often cared more about profits than people, and they looked to the government to try to solve this.
Oh, all right. Well, that makes sense, because my mom says that billionaires suck too.
Yeah, and upon entering the presidency, Theodore Roosevelt, in his first words to Congress, understood that the role of government must change, stating, "The tremendous and highly complex industrial development, which went on with ever-accelerated rapidity during the latter half of the 19th century, brings us face to face at the beginning of the 20th with very serious social problems. The old laws and the old customs were once quite sufficient to regulate the accumulation and distribution of wealth. They are no longer sufficient. Since the conditions are now wholly different action is called for." And Roosevelt became the first of 3 progressive presidents that took to empower the state with new duties in order to improve the condition in both the economy and society. So, progressives felt that if government was now to assume new responsibilities and harness more power to better society and to protect the citizens, they would simply need a better government and greater democracy. So at the local and state levels, progressives passed the initiative, recall, and referendum. The initiative allowed voters to propose legislation. The referendum allowed voters to vote directly on legislation so they could effectively pass laws directly and not need their legislator or representatives. And the recall allowed the voters themselves to remove a public official if they were seen as being corrupt or otherwise not serving their constituents. At the national level, the 17th Amendment was passed, and that allowed voters to directly choose their senators, who had been previously chosen by state legislatures. All of these things, the initiative, recall, referendum, and 17th Amendment, put more power into the hands of the voters and carried on a tradition in America of expanding democracy. But progressives had a major blind spot themselves, their lack of concern for Black Americans. There simply was no major reform movements led by these middle-class crusaders that fought for blacks at a time when the Jim Crow system of discrimination and segregation was becoming deeper and deeper entrenched in the South, and Northern blacks faced serious discrimination as well. And just as blacks had the doors closed to them in America at the time, so too did the women who were literally fleeing for their lives as the Ash building set ablaze. Since it was a Saturday, the workday ended early. It was 4:45. Some of the girls were already packing up. Some were collecting their pay. There was about 500 of them between the 8th and the 9th floors. Smoking was prohibited in the factory, but it seemed that someone, probably one of the few male workers, since it was not common for women to smoke, especially in public at the time, lit up and then dropped a match that fell on some loose cloth on the ground. In seconds, the place was ablaze. The lightweight cloths of the shirt waists were perfect tinder. Panic ensued. Some rushed to the elevators. Only 1 out of 4 was in operation. It took 30 of them down at a time and then back up, but after a few runs, it broke. The fire then rose to the 9th floor, and more were trapped there. Some had managed to get out one of the exits and down the stairs before being cut off. The other doors were kept locked, though, to prevent women from stealing or taking unsupervised breaks, and they were piled against the door, ramming against it, but it just wouldn't give. Afterwards, the fire department had found remains piled high outside the door, torched to the bone. The New York Fire Department, the best equipped and most modern department in the country, was there in just minutes. But despite all their efforts, they could not be heroes that day. Their ladders only reached as high as the 6th floor and were out of reach from the women. Their hoses did not get enough pressure to do anything against the blazing fires on the 8th and 9th. And then, worst of all, they soon realized that their nets were not strong enough, as women jumped 2 or 3 at a time and ripped right through and died at the firemen's feet. Other women headed for the fire escapes, but they were shabbily built and soon buckled and broke as several women fell to their deaths and trapping dozens more behind them. Passers-by on the streets began to gather as they saw puffs of smoke overhead and heard the shrieks and wailing of the women in the Ash building. Rather than burn alive, women started to jump to their quick deaths. The haunting sound of body after body hitting the ground was recalled by a witness. I saw every feature of tragedy visible from outside the building. I learned a new sound, a more horrible sound than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding living body on a stone sidewalk. Thud, dead. Thud, dead. Thud, dead. Thud, dead. 62 thud deads. I looked upon the heap of dead bodies, and I remembered these girls were the shirtwaist makers. I remembered their great strike of last year, in which these girls had demanded more sanitary conditions and more safety precautions in the shops. These dead bodies were the answer. In 18 minutes, it was over. 146 were killed, the majority of them young women. The youngest were just 14, and most were not yet 20, and many were so-called greenhorns, who had not been in the country a year. It took weeks to identify the dead and to sort through their belongings. 7 were so badly burnt that they weren't identified, and they had a special city burial. The owners, Blank and Harris, were indicted to answer to those 146 bodies. In trial, though, the jury had found that the owners could not be held responsible for the locked doors or the accident, and justice, it seemed, was denied. In a civil suit that followed, though, the owners settled and had to pay $75 for each victim. That was the price on their lives. But if justice was denied in the courts, then the progressive reformers would take to the ballots and to the streets. From this horrific tragedy that I feel cannot really be called an accident, it led the city to see the situation that the workers faced in a new light. The sadness soon turned to anger, and the anger and frustration led to a fervor and determination that this could not and would not happen again. The ashes of the Triangle Factory fire proved to be ripe soil for the progressive movement to take on greater reforms and usher in greater economic and political transformation. In the days after, the Women's Garment Union took to the streets. They were joined by other unions, and workers from all over the city and others in the country joined in similar protests, and politicians were pushed to take action. In the years that followed, the city and then the country passed stricter workplace protections for their employees. Safety protections like sprinklers that might be expensive and cumbersome became mandatory. Beyond that, and maybe more importantly, government regulations were given teeth and would be enforced to ensure the workplace and worker protections. As a teacher, during every fire drill during the year, when I walk out with my students in single file fashion, I always think of those 146 victims, and I feel the weight of history upon me. I do hope that my students, and now you do too, feel it as well. Thanks for engaging in history today. This has been History for Humans. If you enjoyed this lesson and what we do here, it'd be awesome if you clicked and showed it and gave it a thumbs up and subscribe and all that other stuff. And you can head to our website where we have forums for you guys to jump into conversations with students from across the country. But stay tuned because we got a great lesson activity for you as well. All right, guys, this lesson should be good, should be interesting, and should get you guys debating and discussing as a class and maybe with your friends if it's really good, even on your free time. You're going to first read to get some more information about this triangle factory fire from a secondary source. As you're reading, you're going to be thinking, who is really to blame for this fire? Was it the government for not enforcing any regulations? Was it the owners? Or could it be the workers themselves? As you're going through the readings, you're going to be recording evidence on how each of the groups could be responsible for the tragedy. After the reading, you're going to look at a couple primary source images, which is pictures and a political cartoon. And once you have all the evidence from all the sources on your paper, you're then going to go to step 2, where you fill out a pie chart and assign a specific percentage of responsibility to each of the groups. And then you're going to move on to step 3, which is an argumentative writing piece, where you explain who you think was most responsible and why, and then what could be done to prevent a similar tragedy in the future. All right, you guys are going to rock it. I know it. Take care, and I'll see you next time.